Hi guys, welcome to chapter 2. So we are going to be talking about child development around the world, what world demographics are, the changing ages and birth rates and how these affect population. And it's important to know these demographics because they affect how children develop in their different countries, their different cultures in different ways. So if you have a rich country versus a poor country, if there are lots of old people in society versus lots of young people, these will all change the experience that a child has as they grow up. And why it's important is you can assess your own childhood, you can analyze it based on where you came from, what it was like, were you high SES, which is socioeconomic status, so were you rich upper class, were you poor lower class, or somewhere in the middle. And that will help you to understand why your parents did what they did, why your situation was how it was, if you had a stay-at-home mom versus your parents worked 3 jobs, or you had a nanny, right? These are all going to affect who you are as a child, what your childhood was like. And also, if you ever become a child therapist or need to work with children, you can understand their situation if you understand the impact of culture. So let's talk a little bit about the demographic divide around the world, the differences. Today, the average number of children per family is lower than at any other time period in history, and yet the number of children is at its highest and rising. So there are a lot of children in the world. There's more people in the world, period, although families on average are having less and less children. Now that does depend on where in the world you're at. Developed countries, which are the more affluent ones, will have less children. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. So historically, the average woman gave birth to 4 to 8 children. Most of those children died. To get past the age of 15 was very difficult. Once you got past the age of 15, you generally lived until the age we live till today, 70s, 80s. But the average life expectancy was like 35, 40 because of infant and child mortality. And that obviously will affect your attitude towards children. In places where infant mortality was really low, some people didn't name their children, and there often was a lot of child labor, like kids working in coal mines, because you couldn't get attached to your children because they would likely die. So we look at the total fertility rate, the TFR, which is the number of live births per woman, and that is currently 2.5 worldwide. Which is higher than the replacement rate of 2.1, which means that our population is actually now decreasing. So you need 2.1 people born, 2.1 live births per women in order to, I'm sorry, did I say lower? Yes, I did. Okay, cut that. It's higher than the replacement rate, which is why the population is increasing. I'm just talking without thinking. However, it's expected to decline to the exact replacement rate of 2.1 by 2050. Okay, so my mind is just skipping ahead. So we are not yet as low as the replacement rate, but the total fertility rate is dropping. And in some countries like Japan, let's see, Korea, Canada, places like that, the total fertility rate is actually below the total replacement rate. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. If not, read your book. So according to the United Nations, nearly 50% of the population in developing countries is younger than 25 years of age, and it is less than 30% for developed countries. So you probably already know this, but you've got developed and undeveloped countries. So developed countries are what we would call a first world country. So we're more affluent, usually better healthcare system, more technology, and so on. An undeveloped country would be like a second or a third world country. The populations of most developing countries, despite the fact that our total fertility rate is in many cases below the replacement rate, we're still expected to have a steady population, mostly because of immigration. So for instance, the people in the United States, we are having less children, but we are having immigrants come in and replace the children that we would otherwise have. And that's also why you're seeing population race changes. So it used to be predominantly white in America, and now the Mexican population, for instance, is expected to be the majority race pretty soon here. I can't remember what year, but yeah, it should be soon. Okay, Canada is also experiencing increases in population for the same reason, immigration, whereas countries like Germany, Taiwan, Japan, who have less immigration and also low birth rates, they are declining. And the big problem with that is it can cause an economic implosion. So the economy can crash because you don't have enough people to support it. That's also an issue if there are too many children or too many elderly. So those are both two populations, two age ranges that depend on the people in the middle to support. And if there are too few people in the middle and too many people on the edges, then again, you have an economic collapse. And that also happens with like income classes. You have too many poor or too many rich and a small squeezed middle class, then you have economic issues. So the middle class, just like middle age, is the most important economically speaking. All right, so if you look at variations across countries and cultures in terms of like income, education, cultural values, you also see a lot of diversity, which can significantly affect child development, how the experience of childhood is, and what parental involvement in children are, as well as the economic impact of children. Like having children in America is way more expensive than having children in, I don't know, the Amazonian rainforest. Okay, so it doesn't cost, well, it doesn't cost anything to have children, at least not cash-wise, although it costs something resource-wise. All right, so there are large income and educational differences amongst countries, especially between the developing and the developed countries. 40% of the world's population lives on less than $2 per day. 80% live on a family income of less than $6,000 per year, and Africa remains the poorest region in the world. All right, 90% of individuals in developed countries are in the top 20% of the global income distribution, which means that most people in developed countries are living wealthy. Like we are living, you complain about being poor, you don't have money, you know, you don't have the latest iPhone and you don't have the nicest sneakers and you're so poor and you wish you had a better computer or whatever. You are richer than almost everybody else on the planet. And that's something that we have to keep in mind and appreciate what you have, because most people are not living the way you and I are living. Now there are people, obviously Donald Trump and, you know, the Vanderbilts and so on, who are living way beyond what most of us live. However, even the poorest person in a developed country is better off than, you know, people in undeveloped countries, the average person, okay? All right, there's also an educational divide between developing and developed countries. Nearly 100% of children in developed countries go to school. The public educational system, while it certainly has its problems, is way better than typical schools in undeveloped countries. If there are even undeveloped, I can't speak today, even if there are schools available, which there may not even be schools available for kids in undeveloped countries. Some kids have to do crazy things like climbing down mountains to get to school. Many kids in undeveloped countries, they have to go away and live at school because there's nothing accessible where they are. So 6 months, you know, they're at school, they come home for a little while and go spend another, you know, 4 or 6 months at school. So we are lucky. In developing countries, 80% of children attend primary school, so that's like elementary school, but only half go to high school, and only the rich go to college. Okay, so it's very unusual in a developed countries to go to college, whereas you're basically going to college, not for free, but, well, many of you actually are going to college for free. So you know, we complain that there's not free education in the United States like there is in like Denmark, for instance. But if you are poor, then there is at least very low cost education, like compared to a $60,000 a year Ivy League school. So appreciate your community college. Okay, anyhow. Another difference between developed and undeveloped countries are their values. So you have individualistic versus collectivistic cultures. And there are pros and cons to both. I don't remember who said it, but somebody said the most dangerous words ever spoken are for the greater good. And a lot of bad things in life have been done for the greater good. I mean, Hitler killed 6 million Jews and millions of other people as well for the greater good. And that is a collectivistic value, and that's the downside of collectivism. The downside is the individual is not important, the collective or the group is what is important. So the individual can be sacrificed for the good of the greater collective. On the positive side, they usually have stronger family values, multi-generational groups instead of just a nuclear family. There's more community support. However, you also are pressured to not be so individual, to not be unique. In Japan, they have a saying that the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. So if you are a unique person, you're going to be hammered back into place. So good and bad parts of being collectivistic. Individualistic, you're encouraged to be unique, you're encouraged to achieve, you should stand out and you should get ahead and you should do your thing, to the sacrifice many times of the family, of the group. And so many times, like corporations for instance, often, sorry, corporation just tried to kill me. So big companies will often hurt the little guy in order to get ahead. That's an individualistic value. So there's nothing wrong with individualistic or collectivistic. They're just different ways of doing life. But the abuse that tends to come out of them, I mean, and both types of societies abuse, right? It's just something that happens, unfortunately. But they abuse in their own different ways. Okay, so collectivistic, the group's important, you're not allowed to be an individual. Individual, you should be unique, you should be an individual, but many times the group gets ignored and bulldozed over. Collectivistic societies also emphasize obedience, and individualistic don't. So in our culture, America is obviously individualistic. So we tend to have, maybe we won't say it, but we tend to admire the rebellious child that stands up, right? Like for instance, the tsunami that hit Japan. There was a group of school kids, and the teacher said, the tsunami's coming, we have to escape, and so they started leading the kids out. And 2 kids who were the troublemakers in school, the unique individuals, they decided that the teachers were going the wrong way, and they tried to tell the teachers. Teachers said, no, be obedient. That's, Japan is collectivistic. And sadly, the entire group of kids drowned, except for the 2 kids who disobeyed and ran away on their own. And they actually ended up getting swept up in the wave, but luckily they were going up a hill and the wave swept them up the hill. One kid actually landed inside of an open refrigerator and rode the refrigerator up to the hill. So we really admire those people, right? But a collectivistic culture might not be so positive towards that. Of course, they're happy that they survived, but there's also a part of them that, they shouldn't have been disobedient. So anyhow, Germany, a bit more collectivistic. One of the reasons why Hitler was able to do what he was able to do, because you should be obedient, you should follow rules. So somebody comes in and says, these are the new rules, you follow. Also notice with coronavirus, Germans wear their masks. They have no problem with following the rules, social distancing, masks, whatever. They do what they're told because they have that obedience value. Americans do not have that value, right? Okay. Anyhow, moving on. Most child development research has been focused on developing countries, so we don't know as much as we should about undeveloped countries. However, there has been research on that, so we will talk about that. All right, so let's talk about SES, gender, ethnicity. SES stands for socioeconomic status. So that is your social status as well as your economic status. Those are 2 separate things. You can be an upper class person who loses everything in the stock market and you're poor. But your social status in your brain, and maybe also to the people around you, is upper class. You can be a poor person. I mean, look at Meghan Markle, right? She marries Prince Harry, and she goes to England, and people do not like her, right? They have to escape. They're living in Los Angeles at the time. And she is not an upper class royal. And it doesn't matter that she now married into it. So economically, she's rich, but socially, she's not considered of that class. So there is a difference between social status and economic status. So child development varies not only between developing and undeveloped countries, but also between the rich and the poor. Rich and poor countries, and also rich and poor classes within a country. So even in undeveloped countries, you have rich, and you have, obviously you have poor. So we think of third world countries as like everybody's poor, but that's not true. And usually there are some people who are very, very rich. You know, you go to some war-torn country in Africa, you have a warlord who has all the resources he needs, right? And his children are doing well. And then of course you also have other influences within a country. The majority culture sets the standards and norms, the religion of the culture. So my niece and nephew are half Egyptian, and their father comes from Egypt, where, you know, if you're Muslim, you're allowed to have 5 wives. So are you going to have a culture that is respectful of women when you're allowed to have 5 wives? Probably not. And Egypt isn't really respectful of women. Okay, so things like religion, politics, etc. Those are all going to influence the culture and influence how children are raised, what your child values are. Okay, so what's the context? If you look at the PowerPoint, I'm kind of skipping through stuff, so you can go through and look at charts or whatever. So I have these pictures. So of kids, and it's a photo series of kids and their favorite toys. So this is a child in a Burkinami home living on $29 per month per adult, and her favorite toy is an old tire. So this is a child in Burundi. Favorite toy is dried corn. This one is holding some broken down toy, living in India on $31 a month, obviously in squalor. Zimbabwe, living on $34 a month. Their favorite toy is a homemade ball. $45 per month. The favorite toy is a broken plastic doll. Favorite toy is a shoe. This is Ivory Coast. Rwanda, favorite toy are leaves, kind of making you appreciate your childhood more. In Palestine, favorite toy is a plastic bottle. This one's a volleyball in Colombia. Bolivia, $254 a month. So now we're getting into some higher economic living. So this kid has actually 2 stuffed toys. American Home, $855 a month, which is not a huge amount, right? That's still, for America, that's poor. But obviously for these other countries, that's really still really wealthy. And the favorite toy is a Star Wars Lego. China, $2,200 per month per adult. So probably double that. Favorite toy is a military tank model, and obviously all sorts of other things, a fish tank. Kenya, $3,200 per month per adult. Favorite toy is a tablet. Ukraine, $10,000 per month per adult. That's like basically if you have 2 parents, you're making 20 grand, and they have a large stuffed toy. All right, so obviously the economic status of your country is going to severely affect what your childhood experience is. However, you also have to remember that just because you're poor does not mean that you're not happy, okay? You can be poor and you can be happy. And one of the biggest factors in whether you can be poor, happy, or whether you are rich and unhappy is a term that we call relative deprivation. So in this series of pictures, you see where more upper class, middle class, richer people are living next to poverty, and it's just smashed in their face of the poor people that what they're missing, right? So they're seeing every single day what they're missing. And so in some parts of the world, it's very obvious, right? And for us in America, we're also, watching TV. And so we see how the other half lives, or the 1% lives. And so even though we may not be living right next door to it, although you might, you're still seeing how other people live. So if everybody around you is poor, you're just used to it. And so you base your happiness off of something else than your economic status. So you might feel like you're rich because you own a stuffed animal, whereas the kid next door is playing with a plastic bottle, right? Or you might feel like you're poor because you got a Mercedes for your birthday and your friend got a Ferrari, right? So that's what we call relative deprivation. All right, so the context of the environment varies. Our development, our socioeconomic status, which includes social class, education level, income level, your job status. You know, if your dad is a trash man and he goes around picking up garbage, they actually make good money, right? So economically, they have a higher status, but socially, we would consider that person, you know, lower on the totem pole. Whereas your parent might be a professor, and I can guarantee you they don't make very good money, and yet we have high social status. Like, oh, you're a college professor, wow. But that does not necessarily mean that you are rich. Your gender, your ethnicity, that's all going to play a role. Okay, so all cultures, the book says minority cultures are defined by ethnicity, religion, and language, as well as distinct cultural tradition. All cultures are defined by these things. All cultures are defined by ethnicity. Here's some examples, okay? These are white people living in Finland and Sweden area. They are called the Sami people, and they are a native indigenous tribe living in Europe. They are fighting for indigenous rights. Okay? They live tribally. They have reindeers and they live in teepees, okay? This is actually in Europe. You can go visit the Sami people. In Spain, you have the Basque. White people, but they are uniquely ethnic. They have their own cultural and traditional values. They are an indigenous area. So Spain and France has taken over the Basque region. It's been incorporated into those two countries instead of being its own country. Then you have the Circassians in Russia and other Russian-based places like Syria and stuff. They have their unique cultural, ethnic traditions and so on. They are an indigenous tribal people in Russia, even though they're white, okay? And like all indigenous people, they are persecuted. My point is culture and ethnicity. Like, what is your ethnic background is different than what your racial background is. The new field of child development. Child development was not always a field, right? Really up until the 1800s is when people started, well, it's when psychology became a field. And so pretty quickly after that, people started to study children. And this was the time period when you had kids working in the coal mines and, you know, chimney sweeps and stuff in Western civilization. And the child study movement that happened in the 80s with a guy named Stanley Hall sort of started to change our perspective on children and child abuse. Child abuse really started to become a thing in the 1900s. There was a movement to protect children. And then really in like the 60s and the 70s, 80s is when we saw a big push that children had rights. Okay, and that's really recently. So when my mom was a child, she was born in 1960, children, like, you were the property of your parents. And there wasn't really child protective services. There was a few organizations, but they weren't super active, and the cops were on your parents' side. So if you called the cops and said your parents beat you to a bloody pulp, there was a good chance that they would just tell you you should have behaved, and your parents wouldn't have gotten in trouble. So there's been a lot of change just in the recent decades to say that children have more rights. So Stanley Hall wrote the first real scientific treatise, the scientific study on children, in 1896 called The Psychology of Childhood. He said that boys should be roughed up. He thought like they should have cold water baths and they should be taught how to box and they should be denied love and attention. And I don't think that's good either, but yeah, I think children are a little bit soft. All right, anyhow, that's another lecture too. Then we have Freud, of course, the father of modern psychology. So psychology started before Freud, but there was not a good cohesive theory of development in psychology until Freud. And he really focused on early childhood, although he never really worked with children. So on the one hand, Freud was an absolute genius for coming up with these theories of how children develop, and a lot of his ideas are proven by research today. However, some of the other ones are a little weird. And I'm not going to get too deeply into this because you should have learned this in Psych 101. But his psychosexual theory basically said that we all have this sexual desire that is the driving force in our life. It motivates us forward, and he called it the libido. Now, when he talked about sexuality with like infants and toddlers, he was not talking about actual sex, okay? He just believed there was this sort of immature sexual energy that pushed us forward, this sort of like passion for life sort of thing, and that as we grew up into adulthood, it matured into full sexuality. So he did not believe that babies got off by breastfeeding. Okay, he didn't actually think that, even though that's sort of the perception of Freud. He did have some weird ideas, such as Oedipus complex, right? That is not proven by research. So Oedipus complex happened in the phallic stage. So you've got the 5 stages: oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital. Orangutans always play with little gorillas. That will help you remember. And he believed that little boys wanted to have sex with their moms. They had like a sexual desire for their moms, but of course they couldn't act on it because dad would come and castrate them, cut off their testicles and penis in the middle of the night. And so instead, they identified with dad and grew up to become like dad, gender-wise, behaviorally-wise, in order to get a woman metaphorically like mom. Now, castration anxiety is not a thing, okay? That does not exist. However, Freud came up with the first theory of same-sex gender identification, which is a thing. That is a true thing proven by research. So again, it's like amazing genius ideas wrapped in madness, that sort of thing. All right, so I like Freud. I think he was amazing. I also admit that he was very strange. All right, so how did the field expand as we developed past Freud, psychosexual theory, Stanley Hall, Anna Freud, Freud's daughter? She really studied a lot of children. She wrote extensively about teenagers, and she believed that teenage years were fraught with emotional turmoil and distress. And so that's when teenagehood sort of became a thing. Erikson said that the teenage years were more about identity development, figuring out who you are. And so he believed that that age needed some emotional turmoil. But then again, if you look at other cultures, different time periods in history, teenagers were expected to be responsible. Many times teenagers would be running homes, they would be running wars against other people. King Henry II, I believe, who married Eleanor of Aquitaine, he was like 16 when he ran his first campaign battle against someone else in France. So, of course, maybe that was how he worked out his teenage turmoil, I don't know. But yeah, we have different expectations about teenage years. And Erikson did talk about how the more developed the country, the more resources, economic well-being a culture has, the more extended childhood is, because you have more leisure to develop your identity. Whereas we'll talk about this more in the next chapter, if you're in a poor, resource-poor environment, you need to work hard to survive, and you need to contribute to the family, and you need to be responsible in order to make it. So childhood is shortened. All right, so why did teenage years become a thing? One, there was actually a decline in the age of puberty, or for women, menarche, when the menstrual period starts. So that actually steadily declined between the early 1900s and 1970. And the average age of menarche or menstruation in Western countries is 12 and a half, and puberty begins about 2 years early. So 12 and a half is pretty young for girls. And interestingly, the earlier puberty starts for girls, the more psychological issues they have. They get teased a lot for developing faster, for having bigger breasts, and so on. Boys, it's the opposite. So they actually, the earlier they start puberty, the more advantage they have. The other boys look up to them. They're the tough one. They're the developed one. The girls all like him. So the later they hit puberty, the more psychological issues boys have. And while girls' puberty is starting earlier, boys' puberty is actually starting later. And the biggest theory of why this is happening is because of industrialization and the chemicals and so on that have been put into our environment. Lucky us. And also another thing that happened was secondary school or high school attendance started to become normal. So it used to be that, especially in our country, Western countries, like in the 1800s, primary school, the early years were totally normal. Like everybody went. Many places it was made mandatory. It was made mandatory in the United States in the 1800s, and kids went to elementary school. And to go to high school, you had to be an exceptional kid, or you had to have wealthier parents, and then that just became normal and eventually became mandatory. And so again, that extended childhood because you can't be working if you're in school. And then of course, college is now kind of the norm. All right, did I miss anything? Yeah, so there's a chart of the percentage of 14 to 17-year-olds enrolled in schools. So you can see from 1890 to modern times, the more and more kids have been in school. So now almost 100% of 14 to 17-year-olds are in school in our country. All right, hashtag adulting. Adulthood is now part of child development, and the reason is because we have that extended childhood. So we call it emerging or emergent adulthood. Childhood, we now say, extends through the ages of 18 to 25. Two big reasons. One is tertiary education or college, right? College is normal. So that, like I said before, that extends sort of that the time period when you don't have to support yourself, generally speaking. Now, of course, that's case-by-case basis, but we're just talking generalities. And so young adulthood is a privilege of the rich. If you are well off, and by well off, I mean the world standards, right? Not just America's standards, but you are able to go to college, right? If you are living in a third world country where you have to work to survive, you're not going to college. But here in America, even the poor students can go to college because our country has so many resources. It's such a rich country. You get to go to college and you get your extended childhood, you get your emergent adulthood. All right, so anyhow, basically the point of this chapter is there are all sorts of factors, all sorts of contextual things that are influencing who you are as a child, as a person, who your child is as a person, what your childhood is like, what other people's childhoods are like. And so you have to understand people within their context. If somebody's a serial killer, what was it within their context, their historical, cultural, ethnic, economic, whatever context that created who that person was. So you can't judge them by your own life. You have to look at their life, their context to understand who they were as a person. Okay, hope you get the point of that, and I will see you in the next chapter. Bye.